Hey everyone, this is Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I'd like to do a video based on the conversion of material advantage. Basically, you have extra pieces, but how do you convert the win? I'm going to show a couple examples from games with my students, and as well as kind of give you practical tips, as well as give you positions to work out what you'd play. So this is kind of a bit of a preview to my upcoming Chessable course, which is for the avoiding beginner mistakes for the middle game. The previous course is for the openings. That's already out. If you want to check it out, it's in the comments. But I provide a link in the description. But for the middle game, that's one I'm going to be currently working on. I'm actually almost ready to record it, so that should be pretty cool. And I wanted to give a couple previews and also just kind of show you what's in it, that kind of thing. And conversion of extra material is one of the chapters I have. I call it consolidation, meaning you have extra pieces, you have extra material, but how do you actually convert the win? So one of the things that you've probably heard that kind of floats around is that winning a one position is the hardest thing to do in chess. Obviously, it's debatable, but I think it is one of the really difficult things to do because you have to often treat a one position differently than you treat an equal position or a worse position. So there are definitely certain things to look for. But first, I actually want to give you a position so you can get a sense for what I mean. And try to figure out like your current thought process, and then I'll try to give you my own tips and maybe you can alter it a bit. So in this position, you're white. If you've been counting, which hopefully you are, you're always counting material, you want to know what's up. White has won a piece in the opening, which is obviously very nice. So white's currently up a piece, and the question is, what would you play here? Like what are your options? What would you play as white? And, go from there. So take your time and try to figure out a good move for white. So pause your video if you'd like. Keep in mind as well that there are a lot of positions I give. So you'll notice a lot of people when they give positions, it's very specifically there's one best move. If you do a problem on chess.com or Lichess, for example, there's one best move. A lot of positions I give in my videos and in my lessons are positions where there are not one best move. There are plenty of good moves. There are plenty of good moves here. And really, we're just approaching this from the point of view of how do we win a one game? So let's take, first of all, a normal thought process. So normally, like any position, you think, okay, my knight's attacked. I can take this bishop. That looks like a tempo move. I can play knight b5. That's a tempo move. I can take one of these pawns, although those moves don't look very good because they just give away a knight. Or I could retreat the knight. So those are the candidate moves, if you will. You would calculate them, try to figure out which one's best, etc., right? So a move that's really tempting, let me give you for example, is the move knight b5. Perfectly good move. Really cool tactic. So that tactic, in case you weren't aware, is after queen takes e6, you're able to fork the king and queen. Very typical tactic. You're also forking the rook, so it's a family fork if you want to call it that. However, it doesn't really matter that you're attacking the rook because you're obviously going to take the queen. So that's not good. But of course, black's not obligated to capture the knight. They could play this check, but what's funny enough is that this check doesn't do that much because if I play c3, you have to just move your queen again because this is a really cool trick because the whole point is no matter which knight gets captured, and this is the nature of knights, you still have a fork, right? I already managed to highlight that one for you. And then take it away. I'm very good at this. But you get the idea, right? This would also fork the queen and king. So knight b5 just looks like a crushing move. But it turns out that if black plays a move like queen b6, of course it's very good, right? You have many different options. But the general problem is, let's say you capture this pawn and I play king d7. You don't really want to capture anything. If you capture the bishop, for example, with check, I can take the piece and then I'm going to win this knight. Now, keep in mind, you still have a great position. You started out up a piece, but you're going to lose that piece back. That's not really a very good technique at all, right? This would be a disaster. And if knight takes rook, which is a slightly better choice, then takes on e6, and the problem is you're going to probably lose that knight, right? Bishop d6, rook takes a8, whatever. Now, you're not obligated to take the rook, but if you're not taking the rook and you're not taking the bishop, you have to worry about, your pieces getting trapped, like bishop d6 coming or rook c8, bishop d6, for example, something like this, and then your knights are kind of just sitting there. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't believe in this position at all for black. What I mean is the king in the center, you should have a way to break it open. I have no doubt this is good. A computer might even tell you that knight b5 for sure is just the best move and you should play it. But this is one of the reasons why using your own brain is really important, and realizing that with humans playing positions, they work a little differently. So in my opinion, if I were playing white here in a game, I'll be honest with you, I would think about knight b5 maybe very briefly, but honestly, unless it was a very clear win, I would just take the bishop. Why? Because it's simple, nothing's going wrong. Now, my opponent will probably capture the knight, right? They're not going to leave it there, most likely. So they'll take the knight. And now, okay, if you're feeling like an overachiever, you can play this, forking the pawns. This is a very good move, probably. But even if you just castle, you're going to play rook e1, bishop g5. You're up a whole piece for no compensation. And the game is very simple. There's just nothing really to worry about here. Sure, you have to still convert your position, right? I'm not saying that the work is done, but you've traded pieces. All your pieces are good. Everything works well. This is just the simple way to do it. And what I really want to emphasize with this video is that when you're trying to convert extra material, the number one rule is to keep it simple. Now, there are positions where, let's say you're not up that much material or your opponent has massive compensation. There will be no way to do it easily. But usually what that means is your extra material is just not that great, or your opponent has huge compensation. You're maybe not even winning, right? That's a different kind of position. There are certain positions you have to be very precise to win. But if you're up a piece for nothing, for example, like a knight, or like being up an exchange, like a rook for a piece can sometimes be closer. But if you're up a piece or more, let's say, and your opponent doesn't have anything for it, you should be thinking conversion, meaning keep it nice and simple. You do not want any complications at all. Because the fact is that when you have a position where you're up a piece, like say this one, or after castles, if the game goes according to normal, if you develop your pieces, you improve your pieces, right? And your opponent improves theirs. If the game goes according to normal, your position will get better and better just naturally because you have that extra piece. If you gang up on a pawn, you have an extra piece to attack it with. If you trade to an endgame, you're going to have an extra piece to win the game. So trading more pieces, good for you. Any kind of, like if you build an attack, your attack will be stronger because you have more pieces. So the game by itself will favor you. Naturally, just playing out normal moves will favor you. So what that means is that you want the game to stay normal, because if the game stays normal, you will win. And I'd say that's a very big piece of advice. The other thing I would say is that positions like this, where you're up a piece, you don't blow them little by little for the most part. The only time I really see that is where someone like, a really, really high-rated player blunders a piece against someone like 1,000 points lower or something, and they slowly win the game back. But for the most part, that's not something that happens, right? I would say most games, if you blow a position up a piece or up a rook or whatever, it's because of a blunder. It's because of one really bad move. So generally speaking, in most positions, obviously you'd like to play a good move. You'd like to, trade pieces and improve your pieces and play good, strong moves. If you have a forced win, you should try to find it, right? I'm not saying, you should ignore any potentially forcing move or win. I mean, forcing moves are often how you win the game. But your main job is to not blunder. The way you blow a position like this is by blundering. It is not by playing slightly inaccurate moves. Slightly inaccurate moves eventually can add up. But for the most part, if you're improving pieces and making your position better, you'll be fine, when you're up a whole piece, right? When you're up a significant amount of material. So this is the real lesson. In the game, my student played knight g5, which is also fine. I'd like taking the bishop because trading pieces, generally speaking, pieces, not pawns, keep in mind. Trading pawns, it really depends. And in general, I don't like trading great pieces for terrible pieces, even if you're up material. That's one thing I definitely see. But for the most part, you're up significant amount of material. Trading pieces is nice. This doesn't trade, but it's fine. you know, the knight's decent. But after h6, my student did play an error. So in this position, again, you can pause your video if you'd like. What would you do? What are your options? What would you play here? And the really simple answer is you should just retreat your knight. Nice and simple. Knight comes back. You could put it on h3, but there's no reason to put a piece on the side of the board. The only tempo move you have to worry about is the move e4, but this just leads to more trades. Takes, so the queens are interacting. If they take, the king here is not even that bad, but taking with the knight is simpler, just to not give anything. And if pawn takes, you have different squares for the knight. I happen to like this one because g6 is kind of a nice little square. You might initiate another trade. I understand you're taking a bishop that hasn't developed. But you might just go back to c4, you just get your pieces out. The main thing is you do not go on adventures. You keep the game nice and simple. The main thing I see people do wrong is they try to do too much, and that's kind of what happened here. Unlike in the previous position, here knight b5, which was what my student played, is just a very serious error. And I like that people look for these kind of things. Like, you should always look for tempo moves. But in this case, this knight is hanging, right? And you've put another knight on a vulnerable square. So what that means is the move queen b4 check. Now, it's not a disaster for the b5 knight because luckily the knight can come back, but now this knight would hang. In the game, I don't believe black actually took it. The game went on, etc. But I did want to show this moment because to me, this kind of move I see too often. So again, trades are pretty nice. You want to keep the game as simple as possible. And your main aim is really to not blunder. So this is a bit of a simpler example. I actually want to show an example where the material is a little closer, but is definitely a very winning position, played by another student of mine. And I want to show what's possible there. So let's move on to the next game. So this position is definitely a bit more complicated. As you can see, white's not even up a pawn yet, right? Like, this is actually much closer. But there's the b7 pawn hanging. The f3 pawn is loose. It's definitely quite a winning position here. And here my student played a really, really nice move. So if you'd like to pause your video and try to find it, please do. The essential thing here, by the way, is to see the opponent's threat and to look for your moves appropriately. So you'd like to take something, right? So the main thing to look for are these moves, right? Knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and rook takes b7, right? But the problem is, when you see your opponent's threat, it actually is quite clear that one of those moves is best. And the opponent's threat is the move knight to c3. So after queen takes f3, you actually hit the knight. Now, if knight takes f3, this move is probably just not good because you have knight c3, forking the queen and rook. You do not want to lose an exchange, right? Obviously, you can do this and take the knight back, but this is unclear at best. Like, I definitely don't think white's losing, but there's no reason to do this. The move rook takes b7 looks nice, but the general problem with it, I think after this move, you might be able to play knight c6, counterattacking the queen, although this is very unclear. The main point, by the way, is that if the queen moves, for example, here, and you take the knight, once again, we have our friendly knight fork. So if you try to capture the bishop, I fork you. Maybe there's another move as well, like queen takes pawn is actually also maybe interesting just because after bishop takes knight, the knight on c3 is kind of almost trapped. There's bishop a3 hitting the rook. I don't know. This is, again, the way I look at this is I don't want to deal with this. I have a great position. I don't want to mess with anything complicated, right? We're sticking to this. So white happens to have the very nice move, queen takes f3. So the idea is that you're preventing knight c3 because the queen's guarding that square. And you're hitting the knight, which is very nice. So black has different options. They could attack the queen with a move like knight g5. You could take this knight, but even just moving the queen is possible as well. You have to be a little careful because there's bishop takes knight and forks, so maybe you should actually take the knight. Or even queen g4 might be a nice move, the idea being you're threatening bishop takes knight. So this is actually probably my favorite move. So you can do this. This is quite nice. But for the most part, there's no real great tempo move for black. Nothing too great. So this is a very, very nice move. But the main position I actually wanted to show you was the next one. I just wanted to have you find queen takes f3. So knight takes g3. And this took my student by surprise. Moves like this often do. They're called desperados. Basically, the knight is loose on e4. So they might as well grab a pawn before recapturing this knight on d4. And moves like this are very hard to deal with. And I'm going to have you find what you would do as white here. But again, I want you to keep in mind the rules, right? Number one, keep it nice and simple. Trades, generally speaking, are our friend, right? We're not up as much material here, but the idea, generally speaking, is that we're going to be. So this is definitely a closer example. I didn't want to give anything too simple, but the process is the same. So keeping it nice and simple, and find something that appeals to you in that way. So take your time, pause your video, and try to figure out what you would do here in this mess. So my student played the move rook d1, which is not by itself so bad, but it's definitely not my favorite move. A lot of people get tempted by various like knight moves attacking, but they can just be captured. They're not really doing that much. But I want to keep things nice and simple. So I want to play h takes g3. So first of all, notice how I'm taking this way. I could take with the f pawn, but I don't like... First of all, people get way too excited by this capture. They're like, ooh, my rook's open. Yeah, but your king's open too. And I don't like that bishop takes knight is check. That's also a bit annoying. If it weren't check, I would consider it, but I like... Oops, sorry. But I like h takes because now the king has nice shelter again. The king's very safe. I always want a safe king. If you can attach a third rule to what I've told you, when you're trying to convert extra material, keep your king as safe as possible. Because a counterattack, if you think about it, right, a counterattack, getting your king attacked is one way to counter extra material, right? If your king gets mated, it doesn't matter how much material you're up, right? If your king's in danger, you have to compromise your position a lot of the time. So keeping your king nice and safe is nice. I also like that it's simple, because black is pretty much obligated to take this knight. And here you have plenty of reasonable options. Rook takes b7, of course, cannot be terrible. Grabbing that pawn. You do have to contend with a move like queen c8, attacking the rook and pawn, so it's not my favorite move for this reason. But even if you have to play like queen b3, it's not terrible. It wouldn't be my choice. I don't like that after queen b3, maybe the queen comes out to h3 and harasses you. I don't know. Most likely it's totally fine, but not my favorite option. You could play rook d1 first as a nice intermezzo. This would actually transpose. My student could have gotten this position as it was. But attacking the bishop, if the bishop really wants to guard the king, but then you can take this pawn and your pieces are good. You can also just try to shove this d pawn too. Like in a lot of positions here, for example, you have different options that are very tempting. Bishop b2, trying to take advantage of the king, is tempting. The simplest might just be bishop a3, hitting the rook, and then hitting the bishop, and these pawns start going. Rook takes b7's in the air. This is not a very pleasant position for black. My move of choice was actually bishop a3, so you're hitting the rook, and the idea is that they can sack the rook, but that's definitely going to be very pleasant for us. And if rook e8, now we take on b7, and notice how, unlike the previous position, we're actually targeting this f pawn. So just because you're up material doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking for tempo moves, but notice how my tempo moves are very simple. They're not complicated. They don't allow any counterattack that's significant. And it continues to pile pressure, which means black doesn't have the opportunity to play a move like queen c8, because I just take on f7 and then deliver checkmate, right? The rook defends the queen, notice. So this is just a disaster. So black would go here to basically be like, don't hurt me, right? But the nice thing now is you can say, okay, well, now I'm up a pawn, but more importantly, look at these pawns. I mean, it really feels like white's up 2 pawns, because this h pawn is not really going to do a whole lot, whereas these central pawns are going to push in a hurry, and black will feel a great deal of unpleasantness. So, as we're seeing, this would have been a very simple way to win. Rook d1 was played. Again, the main thing I don't like about it is just it's more complicated, right? Black has different options. Black can move the knight. Notice how also, because what happened in the game was black captured here, and white had the opportunity to correct their mistake by taking, which would have been very good. But instead they took the bishop, and now after knight f5, sure, you have a bishop that's good against these dark squares. It looks very nice, but you also have an open king. You have a bit looser pieces. You're not going to win the b pawn so easily. So all of a sudden you have a position where things are really murky, and it's not so easy to just win this position. I especially just don't like that the king is open. There's no reason to have an open king. And when you're trying to convert, even if it's just an extra pawn with a huge position, which is what this is, it's not like an extra piece, but it's a really amazing position. I just don't like having an open king like this. So again, keep it simple, avoid blunders more than anything else, and avoid blundering more than anything else, and keep your king safe. These are just super important things to keep in mind. Because here the position is kind of weird. It's still very good for white. But for example, I checked with computer briefly. I like to do that just to make sure I'm not giving you something too boneheaded. And computer wants to play rook f4, which is such a weird move, right? Like, it looks stuck. It wants to play bishop e2. Sure, you can play queen c3, but there's always f6. It's definitely not simple. My student played here, which is a tempting move, which is also okay. And it pays off, because here, black plays rook e8. If you want to pause for a moment, see what black overlooked. But yeah, I mean, they forgot that the pawn on g6 is pinned. Sure, you have a check on the back rank, but the king moves up. The king's actually relatively well covered here. There are no real checks. And this bishop can move because the queen, notice how it defends this rook here. So you're not even really pinning the c1 bishop. So this white was able to win pretty comfortably. But if black had played queen d7, for example, covering the knight, protecting the pawn, this rook on g4 looks weird to me. Like, the knight can move and hit it in a lot of cases. Again, I would take white, but the position is far from clear. And notice how it started going wrong when white allowed all these complications, right? So part of it is not so easy because you have to determine that your position is winning. A lot of the times, again, if you're up a bishop for nothing, or you're up a rook for nothing, or, even a rook for a pawn or two is usually like whatever, right? That's usually pretty good. You usually know when you're completely winning. This one was a lot closer, but it was quite clear when you saw the position that it indeed was like really powerful for white, like completely winning, not close to, black being able to draw, right? Like, it was an extra pawn and then some, basically. So when you have a position like that, you really want to keep your options as simple as you can. And that kind of goes with the second rule of avoiding blunders, right? If you keep the position simple, you're far less likely to blunder. And often what that means is playing moves that are not technically speaking the best move. And it's why I don't love looking over your games with computer and assuming that that's always right. Not that the computer's wrong about the evaluation. Almost never will that be the case, these days especially, right? When I was coming up, computers were wrong actually fairly often. Now, like, pretty much never. But it's more, they can still be wrong for you. A computer will, consider a move that's like crazy complicated and you have to find like something really specific, like a checkmate in 6 moves that's really complicated, let's say. It'll favor that over taking a queen for free and you can win in your sleep, but you're not checkmating in 6 moves. The computer will tell you that's a mistake. And it's wrong. Like, for a human being, you should just take the queen, right? Like, keeping things simple for human beings is really, really important. And I think that's the number one thing to take from all of this. And that goes hand in hand, again, with avoiding blunders, right? You're not going to blow it with a couple small mistakes. You're going to blow it by making a big mistake, by, hanging a piece, by blundering a tactic. By keeping the game simple, you're far less likely to blunder. And if you don't blunder when you're completely winning, you should win the game. There are cases where you can do nothing for a ton of moves, and then your opponent improves their position. But again, I don't find it to be that common. Usually it's blunder that really makes the game go south. And then again, something that also goes hand in hand with all this is the keeping the king safe, because if you have an unsafe king, you are more likely to blunder, your position's harder to play, and your opponent's more likely to get counterplay. If you have a safe king, it's extremely unlikely they can hurt you, which means that, again, you can just use your extra material to win in a way you would see fit. So it's one of those things where it sounds simple, it's really not. I think positions, even if you're up a piece, like a lot of people turn their brain off, it's not easy. You want to take your time. You want to treat the position seriously, because converting a one position is not that easy. But if you keep things simple, try to follow these steps as much as you can, I think that you'll find you'll have a lot of success. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you really like these videos I'm doing, like, subscribe. If you haven't done so already, it really helps support me, shows me that, okay, like I should keep doing these because people like them. But the comments and support I've gotten so far are really excellent. Once again, this is a preview to an upcoming Chessable course. If you like the material I do and want to see more of it, you can check out my current Chessable course on beginner mistakes in the opening. The link's in the description. It has, a lot of format kind of like this, where I have you solve positions and things like this. And it's aimed at beginners, but even if you're slightly, like I've had intermediate players tell me that they've been challenged by some of it. So definitely give it a try. And yeah, again, stay subscribe to the channel, and you can check out when my next video will be. I'm trying to do 2 a week, so stay tuned for the next one. Have a good one.